Today I'm going to show you how to craft a beautiful garden even with no experience and no qualifications. Do you ever feel like everyone else knows what they're doing except for you? What if my garden looks terrible? What if I choose the wrong plants? What if I'm just not creative? This video's mission is to disarm these fears and empower you to craft a beautiful garden. If you have a grasp of a few key principles, it's not about formal training, it's more about creativity, confidence, trial and error, and a lot of the time it's about intuition too. When I'm out and about speaking with clients, I notice a lack of confidence comes often from a lack of formal training. There's a belief quite often that you have to have been to horticultural college or design college in order to achieve something worthwhile. Maybe you don't think you have a designer's eye, or you feel like you lack artistic ability. One little tip, by the way, if you do feel like this, I would hugely recommend a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's a classic, it's not new, it's an absolute breakthrough if you're someone who feels like you're blocked. Maybe you got criticised in the past about lack of creativity, or you were told at school you weren't creative. If that's you, completely worth checking this book out. I'll link to it in the description below. And there's often like a fear of judgment as well. People worry that their garden's not going to look good enough. They see picture perfect gardens on Instagram and these are very polished. But I think what you have to think about is, who is this garden actually for? Because presumably it's mainly for you. In which case, keeping that in mind, I think, can just take the pressure off a little bit. I understand again from clients that people often struggle to visualize what the garden is going to look like in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years time. If it helps to know, I think so much of a garden, these great gardens as well that we see all the time on the TV and so on, it's trial and error. There's a planting designer in the UK, Nigel Dunnett, considered one of the top planting designers. He caveats his planting designs, he calls them dynamic planting. And I think that's a really clever caveat, because when you work with plants all the time, you know that the plants don't stay the same. You know that some plants will be successful, some won't be successful. Even if you're doing everything right, still some plants will die. The other thing to bear in mind, plants will often choose themselves where to go. Many times people will say they planted that over here, it's ended up over here, and that's because plants often will move towards the light, or if they're self-seeders, they will just grow where they're happy, or else they'll fail completely. But if they do fail completely, it's not a disaster. The whole thing is trial and error to some degree. There are key principles that you can use to safeguard you against wasting your money, and obviously I'm not saying plant anything anywhere, that's a different thing. But I think it's good for us to recognise that there's a lot of trial and error that goes into a beautiful garden, and the planting is always going to be a little bit dynamic as well. Now, I've mentioned a few key principles and they're important. I also think it's important not to feel too constrained by the rules, not to feel trapped by the rules, because again, a beautiful garden I think comes often from intuition and just looking and seeing and feeling how the plants are working together in the light and how things feel in the space. It's about becoming attuned to the space, and a lot of that is intuition and a lot of it is about observation. There are a lot of artists' gardens where the artist has been pretty horticulturally clueless at the start, and yet they've achieved beautiful looking gardens. I can think straight away of Ian Hamilton Finley's Little Sparta up near Edinburgh. That's an absolute triumph. We've got Wendy Whiteley's garden that I've done a video on. She's an artist who knew nothing at the beginning. She learned as she went along. The garden now, it's become a gift to the public, and the public are always wandering through it and appreciating it. And she has done that by look and feel and intuition. And then if the plants have died, then she knows that she can't plant that thing there. I'm part of the volunteer team for London branch of National Garden Scheme, and I see so many gardens and hardly any of them are done by professionals actually. If you look at the thumbnail to this video, that is a stunning shot of one of the beds at the World Garden, which is at Lullingston Castle. That's Tom Hartdyke's garden. He has no formal design training. It just goes to show you don't need formal training to create something really inspirational, something really outstanding and astonishingly beautiful. Now we've broken through some of the psychological barriers that could be there preventing from going ahead to just get started, then what are the few key principles that you really do need to keep in mind in order to make your garden work? Right plant, right place is really the golden rule, and if you've ever heard anyone say that, I think it was Beth Chatto who coined the phrase. All that this means is that you need to pay attention to the conditions of the spot where you want to put the plant to know whether or not it's going to work in that spot or not. That boils down to, in its natural environment, in the wild, what conditions has this plant evolved to grow in? If you don't know too much about plants, it's as simple as looking at the label on the plant if you're walking around a garden centre or nursery, or if you're planning in advance, I always use the RHS database. I will link to that below in the description box. That's a fantastic resource. It literally has all of the plants. You can look at what position it likes, what soil type, what the moisture level is, how much light does it need, can it tolerate shade, etc. If you're not sure what type of soil you've got, you can do a very simple test of rolling the soil in your hand. I'll put a link in the description below, or you can Google it to see if your soil is mainly sandy, mainly clay, or in the middle. If you wanted to take it a step further, you can buy soil testing kits from the internet, which will return the pH value. So we move on to the next core principle, which is layering and structuring. Two key points. In terms of structural plants, what you want the backbone of the garden to look like, I will always put those in first. You put the evergreen structural skeleton in, and then you build around that in terms of the softer planting. But it's also really important and often neglected. You need to have layers in your garden in order for it to work well, by which I mean you need to have levels, 3 levels. So we are thinking of nature here, and if you think about how any kind of natural landscape looks, you will have your trees as a top layer, you will have a mid layer, which is often shrubs, but can be perennials as well if they're tall perennials. And then you'll have a lower layer, which will be like the lower perennials and also any carpet cover, ground cover. Because if you miss one of those levels, it does look like there's something missing in the garden. Third core principle then is cohesion through repetition, by which I mean you're best off avoiding just random odd plants here and there, single specimens of plants. Unless there's big structural plants, of course that's fine to have just one, but otherwise you're really looking to put in groups of planting, because that brings the whole garden together. That's what's going to make the garden look and feel cohesive. I always buy in multiples, minimum 3 and usually maximum 8. The final core principle that I think you need to nail is to just make sure that your garden is not geared up for one season only. Make sure there's at least one plant that will perform in each of the seasons. A rookie error that you want to avoid is doing a one-off trip to the garden centre and buying everything at the same time. And be aware that the garden centres will stock primarily what is seasonal. Less so in a nursery, but garden centres are buying in particularly for that time of year. They have a fast turnaround. In order to make your garden work, you will need to keep the other seasons in mind as well, and make sure you've got at least something that will perform in each season in order to keep the interest there. So I think if you nail those 4 things, the rest of it, like the colours, the contrast, the textures, you can achieve that through intuition, and you can achieve that through trial and error. The important thing is just to get started. Once you've got your plants in there and the plants are growing in, then you can pay more attention to where the light is. Is something blocking the light? You can pay attention to that, and you can adjust as per your observations. So in my opinion, you definitely don't need qualifications, certainly to get started. In terms of horticultural knowledge, there's always YouTube University. I will reference below in the description some gardens that I really enjoy, which have been crafted by non-designers. I've linked to this video here in case you would like to do a deeper dive into one of those gardens that I mentioned, the Wendy Whiteley's Secret Garden in Sydney. Again, no qualifications, fantastic garden, beautiful, and you can do the same. Sonia, to plant fans, over and out.